Perspective now from Washington on what the numbers mean for international rivalries and relationships. Michael O'Hanlon is a senior fellow and director of research at the Brookings Institution. His most recent book is The Senkaku Paradox, Risking Great Power War Over Small Stakes. When you look at the increase in military spending globally, particularly though looking at the United States and China, how do you think we should interpret that kind of increase?
I would not call this an arms race because I see restraint even though I see growth. What I mean by that is that each country is holding their spending to a roughly similar level of a percentage of GDP. And we don't know for sure exactly with the Chinese. The numbers aren't completely transparent. With the United States, there has been a bit of a blip up in the Trump presidency, but we're already well into a fiscal year where the increase is not nearly as great as it had been the year before. And CPRI's got a time lag here. They're measuring spending, and that tends to be something you can only look at once the year is over. So as we now are into 2019, looking ahead to 2020, we're seeing a leveling off of the Trump buildup, and we're seeing U.S. military spending at about 3.1 or 3.2% of GDP, which is still pretty low by any standard relative to 1945. There have only been a couple of periods, like the 1990s, when we were in that range. I'm not going to call U.S. military spending low in absolute terms by any means, but I do think that relative to the size of GDP, relative to the size of competitors, there is not some, race for the stars. It's a more restrained and measured kind of military buildup. And for China, even though we have taken note of how they've become easily the world's #2 military spender over the last decade or so, they have been holding military spending as a percent of their GDP relatively constant at a level less than 2%, which means that if they were in NATO, they would theoretically be criticized by President Trump for not spending enough. And so I'm being a little facetious to make a point, but the broader point is that while I don't relish military spending and don't think it does anybody any inherent good, and it would be nice to have a more peaceful world where we didn't have to spend almost $2 trillion globally on our collective armed forces, I also don't think we should, get ourselves worked up to the point where we sense some imminence to all-out rivalry or even conflict just because military budgets are going up. This is not, by the standards of history, a major arms race.
But at the same time, we do talk about great power competition or great power rivalry, and it seems to be, as you point out, different than it once was. You've also suggested that United States particularly and its allies need to think about that and war and deterrence in a different way. How so?
Well, I think that China and Russia are formidable military powers in an era of formidable military technological change and capability. And particularly if you choose certain kinds of conflict scenarios to consider, it's going to be increasingly difficult for us to be confident that we could be superior to Russia or China, especially in conflicts near their borders.
Right.
And so it's for those kinds of reasons that I think we have to be a little more creative and think about how, if certain kinds of conflicts were to break out, we could be a little bit more asymmetric, maybe even not resort immediately to military lethal force in certain scenarios, and try to prevent great power war. Because I'm not trying to sound Pollyannish here. I'm trying to find a middle ground between, crying wolf and saying there's some all-out arms race, which there is not, but also implying that somehow we're in a fundamentally peaceful world, which I do not agree with or take for granted. We've got tenser relations among the great nuclear weapon states, especially Russia, China, the United States, and we're going to have to keep looking for ways to defuse that.
As so often happens, though, larger conflicts are sparked by smaller ones. And to a certain degree, it depends on how those smaller conflicts. For example, we have Canadian forces, for example, in Latvia, because there's a concern about Russian aggression there. Does it suggest a different approach to those kinds of smaller flashpoints?
Well, I worry quite a bit about the Baltic states, as do many people, and I've just written a new book, The Senkaku Paradox, which looks at scenarios in the Baltic states as well as in the Western Pacific with China. And with the Baltic states, my concern is not so much that Russia would try to take and annex an entire country, but rather that it might try to nibble away near a border region where there are a lot of Russian speakers within Estonia or Latvia. And Russia might use its 2014 foreign policy doctrine that claims a right to protect those Russians, even though they're not really under any risk. But Vladimir Putin could construct or invent an apparent threat to them. And then that could create a pretext to send in little green men just over the border. Putin could say it was a small-scale temporary measure, but it could throw NATO into existential crisis as we debated and disagreed with each other in Brussels about how to respond. So it's that kind of scenario that I worry about most. And for that kind of a scenario, I don't think we should start shooting quickly or necessarily feel the obligation for a direct military counter in the first instance. I think there are more clever, asymmetric, indirect ways to address it.
Like?
Well, I think economic warfare is the essence of it, combined with forward military deployments to make sure that any kind of a little green man aggression doesn't go any further. So it obviously all depends. I'm talking about hypotheticals. But if Putin wants to go over the border into one small town, which, let's say, 50% Russian-speaking, 50% Estonian-speaking, and he thinks he can control the major town squares and establish some kind of temporary martial law, and he'll say he's doing this to protect the Russian speakers who live there. But in fact, I think his real goal would be to lead NATO into a fundamental debate that would tear it apart. And for that scenario, rather than send a Desert Storm-like force to liberate that town and destroy the village to save it, so to speak, I think we should establish a defensive perimeter within Estonia that is close to the town that's been infiltrated, but not necessarily going in to liberate it anytime soon, and then apply concerted Western sanctions of the type we've already applied after Crimea, but that would be more intense and that would be designed to last as long as necessary.
This week, Russia and China are engaged in large joint military exercise. And overall, how does that closer relationship developing between Russia and China make a difference, or does it?
Well, I'm not overly worried about it. I think they're naturally looking for some solace from each other in a world where the West is less friendly, and the United States in particular less friendly. And so it's sort of a natural law of international politics, almost like Newton's laws of physics and reactions and counterreactions. But having said that, it does mean that we have to be careful about getting into a serious conflict with one, because that could create vulnerabilities vis-a-vis the other. So one of the reasons why, for me, these limited war scenarios should not necessarily be met head-on is if we were to meet them head-on, it could require the majority of our available military forces to do so in one theater, leaving ourselves more exposed in the other place. And that's especially a problem for the United States, which of course has alliances in both the Western Pacific region and in Europe. But it could affect Canada or another country that tends to be, very supportive of a lot of important military operations with the United States, especially when they are particularly crucial and the rubber really meets the road and the going gets tough. We know that Canadians and Americans tend to stay together in most of those kind of situations. So I think that's one more reason to be wary of rushing to a military response, because it creates opportunities for the other country if we face off either Russia or China. And we don't want to create that kind of perceived window of opportunity for them.
What does all of this say about the whole idea of a U.S.-led global world order? We've certainly seen the thinking around that change politically, but how does this change it militarily, if at all?
Well, I would guess, first of all, that for many Canadians and many others in NATO and elsewhere, this doesn't feel like a U.S.-led order at the moment. The Trump presidency in particular, but not only the Trump presidency, probably have called into doubt just how much Washington's leadership can be assumed to be strong and resolute and wise. Having said that, I believe the global order writ large, which is partly collectively run by the G8 or G7 now, by NATO writ large, by the major nations, at least within NATO, Japan, a number of friends and powerful countries besides the United States. I think that order is still pretty good and pretty strong. And one of the things I'm arguing in my new book is let's not overreact if there seems to be some fraying in one place or another, like Ukraine. Not every place is equally important to the West. And we do need to push back when China and Russia do things that we don't like, but we don't need to see every threat or every variant of a threat in equally dire terms. And so on balance, the Western world order is remarkable. It still encompasses about 2/3 of world GDP and about 2/3 of world military spending. And that puts us collectively in a very strong place, provided that we stay together.
Thank you very much for your insight and your perspective on this.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the chance to be on the show.